Just an introduction to the main themes. Why is it important? Well, as Tina's touched on, finance capital can be seen in a number of ways. I prefer it to see as the decline of capitalism. And so it gives us a window into that decline. Other people see it as just like another aspect of capitalism called the growth of financialization within the world economy, which seems to be predisposed upon like the ever-growing strength and accumulated powers of capital. So I take a little bit of a different view of that by acknowledging financialization of all aspects of life, including education. Just give you a little insight on education today. The HE, higher education in the States and the UK, I don't know if you've looked into how they're funding themselves lately. Well, it's through capitalization, it's through using corporate bonds, doing bond issues for billions of dollars in the case of the UK, the US, and sterling in the case of the UK, to basically draw down finance from global institutions in order to bet on the future of their growth and potential, which is all based on putting bums on seats from international students, basically. As you can imagine, like any problems there, like a rise in interest rates, which they have to pay back on that bond, or even a fall off in the assets because of the coronavirus right now. There's a threat to, say, the international student market. So we see that financialization of operating even in the likes of universities. And we all know as well that in the local government sector, local authorities, there've been cash strapped for some time. There's been a gap between national funding of local authorities in the UK, and that gap's been filled by going to the financial markets through the Treasury this time, through their organisation, the lending facility within the Treasury Department, and they get it from finance capital too. So, just a couple of examples of financialisation of everyday life. Even our consumption is fueled by debt, as you know, and that debt is taken over, if you like, by financial markets. So finance capital is a little bit different. It's looking at a key issue in the development of Marxist thought on the movement of capital in history, and the movement of the logic of capital as well. You look in Marxist Capital, then you're looking at a logical dialectical process there, where the categories develop. The most famous circuit is money capital, which purchases living labour power, which then purchases means of production, sets them to work to create a product, a set of commodities with more value locked in them, which is extracted in terms of surplus value from labour. And then that finds its way through the sale of those commodities and the return of a larger amount of money capital. So we see the circuit, and we're led to believe that in a nice logical way it expands, this idea of accumulate, and it develops capitalism. It moves us from the formal subsumption of labour, which is like the control of labour through the market, through the wage relationship, to the real subsumption with the development of corporations, where labour becomes part of the appendage of the machine, where skills are stripped away, and more direct forms of control over labour to extract surplus value are developed. So in other words, the key is surplus value. That's what I'm saying. Marx in the Grundrisse at one point wants to define what the essence of capitalism is, and all other social formations. And some of us will know what he came to the way he went into describing that, and that was to say that the key to any social formation, i.e. society, is the manner or form in which the surplus product is pumped out to the direct producers. And under capitalism, that is in the form of surplus value through money capital. And so surplus value and the health of the extraction of surplus value is a kind of litmus test for the health and thriving nature of capitalism itself. Any movement away towards other forms of speculative capital on a massive scale which seems to suggest the opposite, a lack of a thriving within capitalism, and some would say parasitism. And so this was, Marx looked at developments within capitalism, within capital itself, and he knows that the development of joint stock companies and shares, and how ownership of a share gives you an interest-bearing right on the capital itself, productive capital, which can be sold speculatively on the market, and so it has a price which can be sold in the market, and it bears a rate of interest, but it's also owns a portion of that property too, that capital. So it's a kind of halfway house. It embodies certain aspects of surplus value and certain forms of parasitic capital, speculative capital, which Marx called fictitious capital. And he noted like the development of fictitious capital in the form of the rise of bonds, government bonds, corporate bonds, and especially the rise of the stock market, which allowed capitalists in many ways, who are usually owners of production on site, controlling the labour force, to move away from production and to work the stock market and through banks as well, to kind of act as overseers at a distance from the emerging productive capital on a larger scale. So already in Marx, we see this kind of transition, and I think I always like to also reflect on the social power of labour within that transition, and that is to say that where labour was once atomised in production and its sociality come from the from converting direct labour into abstract labour, abstract socially necessary labour. Now the social power of labour within larger organisations become more direct as a social force in the use of science and technology. So Marx also spoke of that, and he begged the question that, well, is there a connection between the rise of stock companies and a kind of social capital emerging distinct from production, and also the rise of the social power of labour and the wealth creating power of labour, which could disrupt and pull apart and distort use and exchange value, in other words, the commodity form? And I think his answers to that was tentatively yes, that value as a measuring rod of social wealth could not keep up with the social power of labour to produce wealth on a grander scale, and it had to fight and fight and fight to control that. And so Hilferding, in a way, takes up the story in his account of finance capital, because Hilferding wants to explain fictitious capital as the basis for a new faction within the capitalist class, which oversees the threat from labour and the threat to the value relation, and also oversees how capital can organise a profit into larger capital in kind of a fusion of banks. So, in fact, Hilferding believed that his major work, written in 1910 on finance capital, was the fourth volume of Capital, because he wanted to base himself upon the thoughts of Marx in Capital Volume 3 about the rise of the stock exchange and joint stock companies. And so his argument is is kind of deep, because he develops a technical argument about the development of credit, money capital, and how this is developed through the banking system, and how the more that capitalism develops, the more money that is required, and so the greater control that banks need to have over the money they invest to or lend to productive capital on an interest-bearing basis. And so as more capital is required to generate each round of production, each year, each decade, then capital becomes more fixed, and an individual capitalist becomes much more risk averse to plan that amount of fixed capital in for a longer period of time, because it only trickles back from fixed capital in a long period of time. And so he has to have confidence in the future of that investment, confidence that he can control the working class and keep on extracting surplus value to the extent that secures his investment, his original investment, and the return on it, and the return over the above, which he can pay back to the bank for the interest that's raised. Is that okay? So we see with Hilferding then a trend towards the development on the one hand of fictitious capital in government bonds, corporate bonds, the rise of stocks and shares, and promoters' profit. And he argues that this is a basis upon which the finance capitalist begins to circulate between banking capital and productive capital, the larger banking capital and productive capital. So their home, the finance capitalist class, is not in banks, it's not in industry, it's in both. And in a way, it fuses them together through fictitious capital, through the ownership of fictitious capital, which is a form of profit at a distance by its very nature from productive capital itself. It's more fluid, it can escape from fixed capital, you know, or the money sunk into large corporations in heavy machinery and science and the technology and labour and so forth over time. So it's a more mobile capital, which also acts to provide more capital to develop industry. And that capital is used to fuse corporate capital, productive capital and banking capital. So we have the cartelization of the corporations, bringing the corporations into trust ownership, and through various consortiums all together, beginning to dominate whole industries, whole banking industry, and whole productive capital, whole industries involved in the production of commodities and in the form of services and products. Interestingly as well, Hilferding talks about the 6 major Berlin banks basically having a large control over lots of the fingers in the pie of across industries tied into the bigger, larger capitals who themselves have control over the industry. So Hilferding comes to the conclusion a social basis is provided for the emergence of a finance capitalist class to oversee production, oversee accumulation. And I suppose what Hilferding is saying is that this is a transition form, because the overseeing includes surplus value extraction directly from labour, labour power, but also fictitious capital, in other words, speculative profits. So it's a transition which, in which the system, the capitalist system, the finance capitalist, relies for its wealth and power upon an uneasy alliance between extracting surplus value and generating speculative profits, which Lenin would call rentier capitalism and parasitic the coupon clipping activities. So the idea of what Hilferding has is that this would be an evolutionary development. He's writing in Germany where it did seem to be going that way, where the banks and productive capitals control their own industries and interpenetrated, and the finance capitalist sat on boards of banks and the large corporations, overseeing accumulation, overseeing the threat of their nemesis, the threat of the working class, and overseeing the competition and stifling out the competition between other capitals in itself. So with the development of large capital, these corporate, these cartels and trusts, so the development of a kind of a periphery of smaller capitals who began to have more dependence, heavily dependent on the larger capitals for their existence. They become supply chains, their existence depended on what was produced in the larger capitals. If you have a big steel works, then lots of things that you make with steel in smaller capitals is dependent on that steel works and iron production, which is controlled, according to Hilferding, by the big cartels. Now they set prices, the powerful, they set prices. Prices are not dictated by the market, but by conscious regulation within production. And so that's another mark away from value itself. So we see this transition in the form of a movement away from value as the arbitrator, and I'm talking about not decisive moves, but the movement away from the pressure of the operation of value and determine the rate of profit, to secure higher prices which stemmed the falling rate of profit, or made other capitalists, the smaller capitalists, pay by extracting profit from them to pay for their own, the declining rates of profits in the bigger corporations, which the economy depended on, and the pattern of development of the economy depended on. And so we have this kind of these transitional forms, you know. And on top of that, we have the development of the working class. In Germany, the development of the working class were in large trade unions, which are dominated by the SPD, the political organisation. So we have like a social and political development of the working class, which added a kind of a more cohesive power, a more organised power against the might of capital. And that meant you had to buy certain sections of the working class off in order to kind of to deal with, to fragment that social power and lead to divisions. So what Hilferding is mentioning in all this is the greater conscious level, the greatest awareness, the greatest conscious awareness that the capitalist class must have in organising capitalism as it develops in a larger scale across society. And he argues that because finance capitalists are not particularly related to any one part of the economy for their profits, their wealth, in whatever form it takes, speculative profit or surplus value, then they can be the overseers. They have a general overview of the economy as a whole, and to guide the appropriate policies, which eventually penetrate state policy in the form of export of capital abroad and imperialism. So there's a dramatic change in the German state policy towards securing cartels in the domestic economy, putting up trade tariff barriers against competition abroad and exporting capital abroad. And the state is also used to bring in a kind of industrial relations kind of regulation to bring collective labour back into the orbit of capital and attempt to control it as it manages the extraction of surplus value. Not this time to maximise profit, as in the surplus value extraction is profit, but to manage it, to control labour too. So it's a maximisation of profit up until it challenges the labour challenges that control. So it's a managed form. Hence, there's a bigger drive towards speculative forms of profit. So it's an overseer, and it relies on the penetration of capital. And there's a lot more in there from Hilferding. Possibly I could pick up some of that on in the discussion which follows. But I'd like to just shift to Lenin, given the time. Lenin, in his imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, writes about finance capital too. He largely agrees with the analysis of Hilferding in terms of the development of large companies controlling industry. But he differs in one important aspect. He argues that Hilferding is wrong about the fusion of banking capital with productive capital, because if you look in other countries, there's a gap there. If you look in Britain, where Lenin spent some time, he was able to see that, yes, there's a rise in stock markets and shares and promoted profit, but there's a market relationship, still an external relationship between the banks, the major banks, and their productive capital. And they use the market to kind of like impose some sort of like structure, some sort of control, but it's not the same. So there's a greater separation in Britain than there is in Germany. And he reads into that a greater level of parasitism. In other words, a greater level of a shift away from surplus value extraction as the form of profit, say, towards speculation, speculative form of profits, through the speculation in already existing surplus value, through stocks and all the things I mentioned before, stocks and shares and bonds, and to ever more parasitic activity, which actually retards, productive capital retards the forces of production and begins to slow down the rate of accumulation and asset strip, and prevent the application to industry of new technology and science. And he called this the finance capital is really the rise of rentier capital, and it's bent on advancing its kind of this parasitic decay in formal capital abroad in imperial conquests, because most of the capital doesn't go so much into investing in brand new technologies abroad, but into government bonds, foreign bonds, foreign government bonds, and shares in rail stock and so forth, which is always like a fluid way of investing that you can move out of quite easily. So Lenin says, you know, what we have here is a parasitic decaying capitalism, which isn't in transition. And he criticizes Hilferding for suggesting that there's some evolutionary transition, which would mean a movement from anarchic capitalism to monopoly to state capitalism, and the conditions are met in terms of the burgeoning planning and administration of production for state socialism, and the working class to just take over that. And so, in a way, that fitted with some of the ideologues within the German SDP at the time, and Hilferding was a paid-up member of the centre faction there, and so you have this kind of evolutionary mentality, which Lenin is critical of. He says, no, there's a firm break. Capitalism has gone through a phase of its peak, so the highest form of capitalism, but it's also the beginning of decay as well, because the highest form is imperialism, but that also harbors financial capitalism, which is driving imperialism, and that leads to the degeneration of capitalism. That's his argument. So we have a debate there between Hilferding and Lenin, and I'd be interested in the way how people see that debate in the discussion. But one thing is that the differences of opinion, and I think there were big differences. For Lenin, it was about revolution, about the need to seize the day from a decaying capitalism, and that required the power of the working class to seize state power. Whereas for Hilferding, it was a bit more seemingly orderly in the way he presented it, seemingly orderly. But there's no doubt that Hilferding made a big impact in drawing our attention to a kind of consciousness in capitalism, an organising principle of not just a finance capitalist class which was buried in competition and couldn't see the wood for the trees, but a class that could stand back from particular spheres of industry to observe what's going on and take action. So I think that's a crucial point being made. And I think Lenin's got his own position on parasitism, which is a useful one for the present. But it wasn't so useful immediately after that debate took place, because immediately after that, as we know, was World War. Actually, while Lenin was writing in 1916, we were in the middle of a war. But that led to the Bolshevik Revolution, which cut off large swathes of the world capitalism to finance capital. Finance capital is it's not global. It needs a global market and global mobile capital across the world. But also, it led to developments of a kind of nationalist politics and a national framework for developing the economy, which was kind of international, globalization. It required the state to intervene in the money supply, take it away from capitalism and speculative capital, and begin to use fiat money, whether through print money and so forth, or just restricting capital flows to use bank capital to begin to develop each nation state in contest with each other. So there's a nationalism developed out of that. But alongside that, the defeat of Bolshevism, which, as we know, led to Stalinism, and it all gets very complicated. But as I read it, Stalinism kind of gave the green light to a way of controlling labour and the working class, while appearing to deliver some form of like socialist alternative. And so what we have is a kind of like Stalinism as a kind of anti-working class force, which presents itself as in terms of socialism, which are developing social democracy, which has lots of tentacles over time in the 19th century, all coming together in terms of you know, how we should organise the economy, organise the state intervention in production processes, and develop a welfare state, social insurance, and that kind of thing. All these were going on for some time, with the emergence of municipal socialism as well in the 19th century. But they galvanised under the social democratic experiment. And as I see it, the glue was the defeat of, or constraint of, finance capital due to the Bolshevik Revolution, and also the failure of that revolution producing Stalinism, which acted as a glue to weld the various strands of social democracy together into a system and create a kind of experiment, which we entered from the post-war period till sometime in the late 70s, when the plug was pulled on that. And so that also arrested finance capital. So because finance capital, its mobility was affected. Sterling, if you like, in the UK wasn't convertible anymore, and so capital had no convertibility. It lost impact abroad. Capital controls were put on capital. Capital could only had to be cared and was controlled in the power it had over investment decisions, and that was taken over by the state. And so the Bank of England and the Treasury were basically colonised by social democratic ideology and how to use money, and they delivered what would probably be the three planks of social democracy, which is policies which generated the partial decommodification of labour power, which is the emergence of welfare, a welfare state, and a guarantee of full employment, so no reserve army of labour to speak of, and also an ability through the welfare state to have a universal source of income which is outside of capitalism. So that basically kind of decommodified labour and presented it with an awful lot of power that it didn't have before the labour movement and the working class. And on top of that, there was the management of money. So state money, fiat money began to control the economy. And so, and that was going to be directed towards using monetary mechanisms, fiscal mechanisms, and monetary policy to intervene in the state, to nationalise important sectors of the economy, to subsidise industries, so long as it went along with the industrial relations and a kind of tripartite agreement, managing prices, profits and wages, and so forth. So in other words, it was a system which began to regulate the way capitalism worked. And it was based on the constraints, the arrest, if you like, of finance capital, and over a period of time, a short period of time. And the experiment was to kind of produce use values that largely outwith the orbit of value creation. So we have the emergence of education and health service, and mining capital taken out of capital ownership, and the steel industry taken out. And they were basically policed use values, administered use values, through fiscal mechanisms. So the money form was there overseeing it in this kind of like sort of mutation, if you like, of exchange and use value. So the commodity form was breached, and that gave power to labour, but it was also heavily inflationary. What it depended on too is a kind of like an administered form of world money, because if each country was trying this experiment out, and the focus is on national economies. Each economy had to have some way of relating to each other in trade. So the Bretton Woods Agreement, which accepted that the gold standard was now no longer the international currency of last resort, as it were, that other currencies tied themselves to. That was changed under the Bretton Woods Agreement, hammered out by the US and the UK as the oldest imperial power, and the America as the new one. So that, and the basics of it was that there'd be a pegging arrangement, and the pegging arrangement was based on the dollar would be pegged to a certain gold value, and then then all other currencies would be pegged to the dollar. But the pegs could be moved, so there could be devaluation of currencies, you know. And that was to allow scope for inflation, which crept into the economy because of the policy that I've just mentioned to you. So it allowed a sense of adjustment to the class struggle within those countries. But it was heavily inflationary, and it factored in a confrontation between capital and labour over the share of the product that was produced. And this time it was over the share of use values and commodities too. And the working class expected the state, social democratic state, to keep on expanding the welfare state, to keep on providing better wages in the nationalised industries, because after all, aren't they socialist? And aren't they like for the benefits of people and the working class, and not capital, which failed us in those industries? So the legitimacy, the social legitimacy of the state was always in question if it didn't come up with the goods in that sense. So there was an expansionary dynamic within state finances, which propelled inflation by an oversupply of money, and also wage inflation through the class struggle, where wages were pumped up, prices were increased to cover profit, any fall in profitability. So there's a kind of ratchet in effect, which led to inflation from below and from above in terms of the money supply from the state. And so to cut a long story short, the experiment with the decommodification, this trying to manage accumulation, led to what was known as stagflation, which is a fall in production, a retardation of production forces, the means of production, as well as like hyperinflation. And so in the UK, for example, in the mid-70s, we had 25% inflation. We had three-day weeks due to miners taking action, which also incorporated steelworks and railways in a massive show of strength, which cut further into profitability, and eventually that led to a strike of investment by capital, and also the inability of the state to kind of keep on spending the way out. In other words, try to manage those contradictions. And that led to certain decisions having to be made. And basically, it led to the pulling of the plug on this experiment. And and we know that in terms of the rise of like what's been described as Reaganism, Thatcherism. But basically, it's to kind of like destroy the compromises of the post-war agreement, social democratic agreements. So in other words, policy direction shifted. There was a movement towards managing the money supply, cutting back on money. There's a movement towards privatization, deregulation of previously nationalized industries, and a massive deindustrialization of large swathes of industry where labor was most powerful and the unions were most powerful. And this had a big impact on the concentration of union power and so their power to act to defend workers' conditions. The spiral of unemployment that followed this in part reinvigorated the reserve army of labour, again the disciplinary mechanism on the working class. But also it pushed workers into the orbit of these privatised industries and accepting new arrangements of work. So there's a basic, to put it basically, there's an attack on the working class And at the same time, as this was going on with the deindustrialization, high levels of unemployment, similarly, the other side of that coin was the freeing off of capital. Capital was now free and mobile to break down the barriers within banking between the investment arm and the current account banking. And then there was a freeing off of where capital could invest, in corporate bonds, in the global bond market, in derivatives, in the world market, and where capital could go to set up. So we had the rise as well through the deregulation of the banking system of the emergence again of important satellites of finance capital within the London, New York, Paris, Tokyo Stock Exchange and Hong Kong. So, and if you look at London during the time of the 80s, that began along with the so-called Big Bang, which used the IT revolution to kind of revolutionize technologically the capacity to deal in shares, to trade in finance and speculative profits, along with the mobility of all sorts of foreign capital to come in, foreign banks, to compete with each other, to invest in a splurge of financial activity, which is free to come and go without too much constraint in and breaking the boundaries of the state internationally. So policy, state policy began to be dictated to by the movements of capital. If under Thatcher's time and later Blair's time, if the City of London and all the big financial centres where the whole in the finance capital was didn't like the particular policies, felt they were restraint on the movement of capital, then currencies would be sold and lowered on the exchange market, threatening the state's economic policy, and there would be threats to pull out capital, and they'd be selling off in bond, maybe in the stock market and stocks and shares, which could lower the value of companies there and so forth. So the threat was on from capital to kind of arrange tight control of the money, a working reserve army of labour, a disciplined labour in the economy, and creating a leaner process within production whereby the share of labour within production fell, and the share of capital in the product that it produced began to grow. So this took place over a number of years, and the outcomes as we know it today, whereby the years of Thatcher and Reagan were really one of the re-emergence, the unleashing really of finance, of financialization or finance capital. We go back to Lenin and Hilferding, they would say it was the unleashing of finance capital. If we look at the kind of capitalism that's been unleashed, then we would have to agree a little bit more with Lenin and maybe a bit less with Hilferding. Because what we have is a massive rise in the level of fictitious capital over productive capital. If you look at the world today, right now, for example, and I know these measurements are silly, I've tried to give a few in the paper there, but they're just silly money. But it gives you kind of an understanding of the power and the patterns within society. And that in the derivatives market, global derivatives market alone, which is basically betting on, gambling on the movements of prices in assets and that. The global value of that, the derivatives market, is 600 trillion right now, estimated to be. Who knows how they measure these things. The value of the world gross production, the world product, if you like, is 6 times lower than that, at around 90 plus trillion a year. If all the money from the derivatives suddenly rested on the real economy, then there'd be a massive amount of inflation that would cripple the system and bring it to a halt straight away. So there's a real division, a real separation between the world of fictitiously generated profits in the form of like hedge funds and future markets and promoter profits through the buying and selling of shares and and government and corporate bonds and the real economy. And this ties in a little bit with what Lenin was saying about parasitic forms of capital being dominant. And so you could argue that we live in a world today which is totally, that Marx would find hard to understand and call, he wouldn't find it hard to understand. He would find it hard to call it capitalism because we don't have a universal equivalent. The gold standard went. The dollar had already come off gold and come on, and the US came off the Bretton Woods agreements in '71. So since then we've had floating exchange currencies, no world units except the dollar, which is a moving currency itself. And on top of that, we have a system whereby most focus of the larger capitalists, the most dominant form of capitalists, the financial capitalist, is on not on surplus value extraction, but on speculative profits. And if we go back to Marx, the secret of any society, understanding the social form of that society and its dynamic, has to be to locate the form in which the surplus labour is pumped out to the direct producers. In the case of this society, yes, we still have surplus value pumped out of the direct producers, but that doesn't seem to be the major preoccupation of the ruling capitalist class at the moment. And in fact, we could say that if you look back at that massive amount of, in the real economy, of 90 trillion in terms of value, GDP, we could say that, well, where would we be today if it wasn't for that parasitic amount of capital that's been unleashed during the Thatcher years, with the ending of the social democratic experiment? Where would science and technology be pursued today to produce enormous amounts of social wealth for people's needs? You know, yes, that GDP, that real economy sounds, you know, impressive if we compare it to the global GDP measured in, say, 1945. But what's it spent on? Ask yourself that. Mobile phones as the epitome of people's lives. Mobile phones are great. This technology we're using tonight is great. But what happens to all the major inventions that we could have, the science that we could be pursuing? You know, we hear these talks about obviously different forms of energy, moving away from the oil basis. We also hear these exotic talks of nanotechnology, but they're deemed to be like highfalutin. But I think those things are only highfalutin at the margins of corporate capitalism and staying there, not diffused, because capitalism is not thriving, it's drifting, and it seems to be in decline as a kind of powerhouse of producing social wealth, even in the form of value, and especially in the form of value. And as Marx says, if value isn't the measuring rod of social wealth, then society is going to be in trouble unless it sweeps that measuring rod away and provides another. And until then, we get lots of speculative activity that we can spend all night talking about, and lots of sexy types of money. You know, money's been about 5,000 years. Money capital is a social relation, and that is in decline. So I'll just leave it at that, because open it up to discussion.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Peter. I think that was very fascinating and opened up a lot of questions. I've got a whole lot of questions on my pad, but I think people from the audience want to speak first. But certainly capitalism is not thriving but drifting. Sounds about right. How long can it drift? You know, it could possibly drift quite a while. Anyway, I'm bringing in Matthew now.
Cool.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I'm hoping that's fine. Yeah, okay. No, I think I agree with a lot of what Pete said, that I think it's worth concentrating on what actually happened in the likes of particularly the 1980s, and the movement from, you know, once the Bretton Woods system had been removed, and the capitalist class clearly shifts away from its concentration on production towards speculative capital, towards finance. That then therefore it goes through this whole period of destroying much of the productive capacity within a number of imperialist countries, particularly the US and the UK, and really starts to shift its, you know, you start to get the creation of speculative devices. Like, I mean, you know, the whole thing with the Panama Papers and so on, that was all originated in London by David Cameron's father, of course. You know, as a means of basically moving all that money around, and you then get the function of the City of London as actually sucking in money from all over the world, and basically, you know, being able to control this vast amount of capital, much of which is not invested in anything productive, as Pete points out. I think the other thing about finance capital is it is because it's in many ways remote from production, and because it's not tied into any particular set of fixed assets, it can be strategic, and thus it has a very strategic view of its class opponent, the working class. And you can see that the difference in terms of the operation towards the working class, its ability to just move production away from anywhere where they think they're going to have a problem with the working class, and to try and maintain the oppression of the working class through both in terms of the organisation of production and of course now in terms of political organisations as well, making sure that all the political organisations which exist essentially are tied into that structure, as we can see with if you look at Keir Starmer's donors, most of them are tied into finance capital. So you can see precisely what kind of the importance, not merely of what he's supposed to do, but also how finance capital sees him, and the importance of maintaining that control over political organisations that it sees. But I do agree with Pete very strongly that we should be saying clearly that capitalism is in decline. That it doesn't function. That is, it's not capable of actually operating as Marx points out, and really post the problem becomes one of the failure of the working class and the political organisation of the working class itself to take power, of which it's had multiple opportunities. All of them have been missed or made a mess of. So really, we're left with this humanity in this major sort of hole, as it were, which we need to dig ourselves out of. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. We've got nobody else with their hand up, so I'm going to ask a couple of daft questions. Just wondering, in the current crisis, then, the one that's come about by COVID and the looming crisis that will follow from that, how do you see that as a reflection of what you say, the capitalism in crisis? I mean, I can certainly see that in terms of what you're saying. There is, imagine how many things we could have achieved, or what invention we could have achieved if we used our money for things that are socially important or necessary, rather than pumping it into fictitious money. That seems to be certainly finding its reflection now, that nobody has a clue what to do about it, whereas it's clearly was a danger. Something like a pandemic is a danger that's been around for many hundreds of thousands of years, and so a functioning capital surely should have been capable of providing for people, of having a plan of what to do, etc. But it seems to be falling apart at the seams really quickly. What I find also interesting about the crisis is now that the nation state is back with a bang in this crisis, in trying to perhaps save its national economy. Again, everybody's doing their own thing, and not in a very planned way. But it's massive subsidies, billions of dollars that apparently weren't there, suddenly being found to invest in the economy. Is that a sign of capitalism in crisis? Which signs do you see? Could you talk a bit more about those signs that you see? Because you could look at the system and it certainly creaks, etc. But it could probably go on for quite some time. So if there's an objective reality that says, you know, the capitalism is in decline, in crisis, but the subjective factor is quite important in that, isn't it? I mean, the capitalism could go on and on and on and on. You know, how can we use our knowledge about capitalism in crisis to, you know, overthrow it in the medium and longer term? Also, in terms of, I was wondering how this, we are expecting quite a crisis after lockdown is finished. We're, you know, some say in the biggest recession ever since capital is counting these things, and yet shares are going up quite dramatically now. How is that? How do you explain these kind of, you know, how does that work in terms of explaining capitalism in decline? How will it find a resolution? So we haven't got any other questions, so maybe you could come back on a few things. That'd be great. Oh, actually, there have been a few hands shot up now, so I'll bring in a few people before we bring you back in. So Liv and Alan, whoever's got their camera on first, will come in first. Who is it? Liv or Alan, could you? There. Liv is first. You win. Hello. We can't hear you at the moment. Can you unmute your? You're still muted.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you now, thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, what I wanted to say was, in a way, when you know, you're talking about, you know, capitalism in crisis, and clearly it is. You know, we've seen drops in production and therefore, you know, profit since the 1970s. However, at the point that we're at the moment, in a way, I think it might be more useful to look at it as a way as a crisis of the United States as the world superpower. Because what happened at the end of the Second World War with Bretton Woods, as you said, is it set up the new system where all the currencies in the world are basically pegged to the dollar. And that has made the dollar the strongest currency in the world because of that. All international trade has essentially been done in the dollar, and that alone keeps the demand for the dollar high, and therefore the value of the dollar high. What we've seen, though, in the past, 30 odd years now, we've seen, though, the American economy, the capitalism declining, you know, across the world, and the American economy suffering also. The American economy has largely been in debt and indebted to China for some time now, largely as a consequence of its wars around the world, and its massive spending on military. And so if you look at where we are at the moment, that picture of the United States, I can see a change happening now, because China is on the verge, if not hasn't already, overtaken the United States as having the largest economy in the world in GDP terms. And depending on how you define GDP, it's already overtaken the United States. One of the consequences of this has been that, well, one, obviously the United States sees China as a massive threat because of that. But it's also led the Chinese to look at ways outside of that dollar dominance of world trade and, in consequence, you know, financialization. And over the since 2016, when the Chinese currency was accepted as part of that basket of currencies that could be used or can be used for settling international transactions, So it now is doing deals with Russia, Pakistan, India, Iran, outside of the dollar, using their own currencies to settle international trade. This is going to have, as it develops, is going to have an enormous impact on the dollar, because the dollar is beginning already to move from being the reserve currency to being one of the reserve currencies. And I think, as I say, when we look at what's happened to capitalism, I think we need to look at it in terms of what's happening with the world superpowers. Well, the one superpower, but how it's now being undermined through the economy and through finance. One of the other things that China's doing, in addition to that settling of international transactions in currencies other than the dollar, is it's also set up its own system of settlement of transactions. Up until recently, it's all gone through the SWIFT system, which is operated by the Americans. So they've had that total control of world finance. This is now being undermined. So I think, it would be useful for us to maybe look at that global picture of what's happening. I'll leave it there for the minute.
Thank you, Liv. Alan, please.
Hi, yeah, I think Liv makes an important point there because I think that what we are seeing is quite potentially the end of US imperial hegemony, certainly in terms of the US dollar and its role in the world economy that's under severe threat. And the Chinese currency, and also they're developing a digital currency, which they're hoping to expand particularly through Asia, and is being seen as an integral part of their, what's it called, the road they've got, Belt and something, can't remember off the top of my head, their expansion through Eastern Europe, through Asia. But it's also Europe, because they finally used their special purposes vehicle for trade with Iran. They're calling it INSTEX, not sure what that stands for, but that is another also potential for being an alternative to SWIFT and undermining of the US dollar. As regards your question, Tina, about shares going up, I think that's an aspect of the speculative nature of fictitious capital. What people are doing there is they're betting on there being a V recovery, a swift jump up in recovery, and that the economy will go back quite quickly to the levels it's at now, or perhaps only just less. I personally think that's unlikely, and we are entering something which might be a small U of an upturn. I think Michael Roberts describes it that way, but will be more of an L-shaped looked at historically. And that's to do with the structural weaknesses which Peter was talking about of international capital. I think it's also important to look at this current economic crisis, which has been kicked off by the pandemic, but was probably coming anyway, in the context of the wider ecological crisis. So I don't see the capacity for capitalism to muddle along in that context. We're going to see increasing impacts of the ecological crisis, which are already locked in. I mean, the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, the continuing melting of the ice caps, the destruction of soil fertility, and so on. There's just so many things which are wrong that capitalism, particularly the way it's organised with its just-in-time and small supply chains, is going to suffer. So I don't think that there is that capacity. What we're faced with is barbarism or socialism, and if you're looking in terms of decades from now, because capitalism's as you pointed out, Tina, capitalism, perhaps the more dynamic capitalism might have been able to respond, but capitalism in these last years of its existence, as I see it, is in no way capable of responding to the challenges which face humanity. Finish.
Peter, shall I take a few more, or do you want to come back now?
Yeah, I'll just come back on a couple. Otherwise, I forget. Yeah, just on the COVID, the current crisis, and I think in a way that the current crisis really reveals the parasitic nature of the system, because what you have is a response to it which is behind the curve. If you look at the UK response, then because finance capital retards production, it fragments production, it moves on the basis of supply chains, cost profit centres, short-term supply of stocks, which are pushed down to the minimum, you know, to reduce costs as much as possible within organisations. And so that a situation is reached whereby the collective capacity of the system is kind of weakened dramatically, and the information flows. You know, we all know about you know, the private finance initiative, and the way that has kind of like fragmented all the contracts within the you know, the NHS, and caused like a complexity of communication breakdowns between contracts and the conditions of the contracts and so forth. And I can see I might be wrong, but I can see a direct kind of reflection in that, in the way the provision of, say, the PPE equipment was so amateurish and dad's army-ish, you know, because, you know, with drastic effects as well, because we just didn't seem to have the organising capacity to know where the PPE equipment was, how much we had of it, whether it was the right type, and we found out that much of it was past the sell-by date. And I think those kind of things are indicative of the abuse of the social power of labour in society at the moment. The social power of labour is immense, but its coordination is being atomised and destroyed by the dominant form of capitalism at the moment, which is short term. So I think the thing about the stock markets, they were going up before the crisis, and they bottomed out, and they made some sort of revival as the crisis has gone on. But stock markets can go up and retard production because, for one thing, the big global corporations are sitting on vast amounts of surplus capital, which they don't invest. They don't even, they invest part of it in the stock exchange to speculate, and that creates a kind of like higher prices and stock prices, and so boom. But they're using, because the interest rates are so low, they're deciding like, well, we'll just sit on our money anyway, and we'll create, or we'll issue corporate bonds, and then we'll use that money, that debt, and play the stock market, and play the derivatives market. And if you look at, one thing I didn't bring up, but if you look at so-called productive corporations, then the financial arm is immensely important within corporations, you know, and they're there to kind of oversee how money is used, how the leaning out of resources, but also avenues of speculation, and using money to kind of fragment the organisation itself by placing branches in profit and loss situations where they're fighting over resources and to keep the jobs or to produce. So that's chaotic, and I see that coming out. If you look at Germany, I know this is kind of maybe a bit of a stereotype, but Germany still has a kind of greater organisational power, and I think that's shown itself in the ability to stay ahead of the curve in such a crisis as this, the COVID crisis. So that's so, you know, the subjective factor. You know, so yeah, if people are arguing that, you know, capitalism is kind of at a point whereby it's kind of heading its own decline in a way, and it seems to bringing about more adverse conditions in employment. You know, this idea of a precarious world labour force, you know, 0-hour contracts across the Western economies, and so forth. And then it seems to me the subjective factor is important, but doesn't have to be global. And one of the things I have about like the Labour Party and joining the Labour Party is it's such a national focused organisation. And I suppose I would say in a kind of idealistic way that we do need to kind of resurrect some kind of attempt to create a fifth international to mobilise ourselves globally. And maybe that's the way forward, organisationally in a subjective way, so that we can bring the knowledge of Marxists across the globe, all have different takes and different bites of the apple of truth, as Hegel once said, at the way capitalism works in their part of the world. And I think that collective set of ideas should be organised within an institution globally, and that would be the way to defeat global capitalism or stand a chance. I think in terms of just another point as well. If you look at productive capacity, they spoke about retardation. Productive capacity has been low for decades in corporations. They just haven't, you know, used the full resources, the full extent of the time, machinery, the fixed capital available to them to produce surplus value. And I think I read somewhere that it's around about 70% of capacity, productive capacity. I suppose that feeds into the MMT debate last week, whereby you print money and you can soak up that productive capacity. China, yeah, I mean, China may be the next world force, I don't know. But it's not capitalism, is it? You know, the bank is controlled by the state. China prints its currency. If it is an expression of like a new imperialism, then it'll bring in a different kind of capitalism that we know. You know, it's not. It doesn't. You know, there is elements of capitalism as we see it, the exploitation of the working class, but it's interpenetrated into the world economy, and there's lots of foreign capital that's developed those production processes within China. And it has to overcome something which is global, which is a tendency for rates of profit to fall over time, given the advances. And one of the things about China that it brings together the highest technological advances with the most developed labour power, most powerless forms of labour. Well, it did, but the labour movement in China has become stronger and stronger. And that may have overcome that kind of like tendency for the rate of profit to fall, as did the swell of products that were produced in China and flooded the markets of the Western world, cheap products, which keeps the value of labour power down. But I think these things are tied in globally. And so, it's like Trotsky says, we don't live in a world whereby one imperial power can reinvent the world as it goes. But we live in a world where each time an imperial power takes power, it ushers in a different kind of world, a different kind of regulation. And also, through the process of combined uneven development, we never have just the same world. And so, I don't see China popping up the same way and doing the same thing and ordering the world about in the same way and acting as a global centre in the same way as America did or the UK did. But I don't know. Could be wrong. Alan was mentioning the environment as well. So if you look at the ecological side, that could be a limitation too. So,
thank you. Yes, I think a webinar on China might be very useful as well. If it is capitalist and if it can overtake America. I'm bringing in Anne McShane, the next question.
Okay, thanks. I'm McShane, Marxist, living in Ireland. Okay, so Thanks, Peter. That was very interesting. I actually really want to raise a point in relation to what you described as the role of the Soviet Union in, like, I suppose, I think you described as kind of providing a model of repression for the rest of the capitalist world and kind of stymieing the development of finance capital in the manner that Lenin and Hilferding and others would have foreseen it as doing. Because it's interesting, I mean, I don't know how many people are at tonight's meeting, but there was a meeting maybe 2 weeks ago with Kevin Bean on the Labour Party, and I raised this issue of the relationship of the Soviet Union to the kind of model of labourism in the post-war periods in Britain. And as I understand it, and it seems to be the position you're putting forward here today, Hillel Tickton has argued similarly that rather than the Soviet Union being a model for the emancipation of the working class after 1928, it became a model of repression for the ruling classes in the rest of the world, for the capitalist ruling classes. So that, I mean, that's an interesting point. If perhaps you can clarify if that's the point you're making, but I believe it's really what Hillel has argued. And I mean, I completely agree that there was a revolution and that there was a counter-revolution in 1928. But it makes the kind of attitudes of many people in the Labour Party into Labour's history quite problematic, because you're essentially looking back, as many people were in that talk that Kevin gave on the Wilson government and the post-war Labour governments. They were looking back on this as being a high point in the Labour movement, with full employment, housing, all of the NHS and all of these other kind of social democratic forms. But what you're arguing, I think, is that this was another form of repression. Obviously, it wasn't as straightforward. Well, in my mind, it wasn't as straightforward as simply the capitalist class going, oh, well, we'll have that model and we'll impose that on the working class in this country, because that seems like to have worked for Stalin. Clearly, there was an issue of the manner in which the working class was struggling and the working class's attempts to impose itself on society in the aftermath of the Second World War. But nevertheless, I think it's an interesting idea, partly also because it connects up with the whole question of national governments that we've seen continue to be argued for among the left, the idea of nationalisation, state control and ownership of society equaling socialism of some kind, or a step towards socialism. So I just would be interested if you want to come back on that. I mean, indeed, obviously in Britain, the post-war period had the NHS and housing, etc. But even here in Ireland, under a Fianna Fáil government, which wasn't like a Labour government and they had the support of the working class, but there was no mention of socialism in any form. It too carried out big, schemes, particularly around housing in the 40s and 50s. So I think that it is an important point. Just one question, 1 point. What I wanted to ask, this has struck me when we've been talking in other meetings, and also when you were speaking today about the lack of resources to fight the pandemic. I mean, I just wondered how the underinvestment that exists today relates to crisis of overproduction. Whether you think that there is still a crisis of overproduction, or whether those things are, whether it's contradictory. And then finally, on China, well, see, I agree. I think we should have a session on China, or maybe more than one session on China, because there's been a lot of illusions touted by groups and individuals these days about the progressive nature of China as compared to liberal capitalism. Because to me, I think China is capitalist. I think it's a particular form of capitalism, maybe it's like a bureaucratic form of capitalism, indeed maybe state capitalist, but it very certainly is integrated with the world market. And yes, it's not the kind of traditional classical form of capitalism, but you know, what is? I mean, there are very many instances of capitalism adopting state forms. It doesn't have to be the same kind of form that the United States and Britain today has. Indeed, as you say, previous in the period after the Second World War, British capitalism was far more state-controlled than it is today. Okay, thanks. I'm trying to...
Thank you. And Steve Freeman, please.
Yeah, I've unmuted myself.
Yes, you've succeeded.
I think the thing about if we just talk about finance capital, then we've seen this whole period of global financialization. But the point about imperialism, it's the combination of finance capital and the state. And it's the combination of finance capital with the state that leads in the direction of war. So we need to actually talk about, in the period of, if we're in a new epoch of imperialism since the 1980s, which I think is what Peter's essentially arguing, then we must be in a period where world war is more likely than it was before. And if world war is more likely danger, because some people think, well, with imperialism, all the capitals merged into one, so there's no point in having a war. But if you think of finance capital being merged with the state, then you can speak of American finance capital, you can speak of Chinese finance capital, and you can speak of European finance capital. European finance capital has got its own problems because of the nature of the EU. But if there's to be a war, it's a war between Europe, China, and America. Now, you could say there's a Cold War going on between them. There's a trade war going on between them. It's not a hot war. It's merely friction, tension. But those tensions have been building up, and they're getting greater. So in the case of China, I think in China, you've got massive amounts of sovereign wealth in the hands of the state, which they're investing all over Africa and all over the world. So China is going out into the world with its finance capital, backed up by the Chinese state and through the Belt and Road Initiative and all these other initiatives that they're taking. And they're coming into conflict with America. There's no question about that. Trump, of course, has wound that up. But he's also wound up his trade war with Europe. So I think we've got to think trade war is merely the precursor for war getting hot, not being cold. And the point about the theory of imperialism was World War I. You know, the theory of imperialism was proven to be correct by the outbreak of World War I. And that's what we need to think of. If we're thinking about the decline of capitalism, then it's going to decline by some other form of war. Now, we've had the Middle East has been absolutely destroyed by war. So the imperialist war has been taking place all across the Middle East, with the wars in Syria, Yemen, Palestine, you know, Iraq, Syria, Iran, etc., etc. I mean, it's a center of an imperialist war going on. There's a war going on there virtually all the time. But it's a regional war. It has not become a global war, but yet it's got the potential for that breaking out, as the First World War did, of the conflict in the Balkans, of what breaking out on a world scale. And I think if we don't bring the question of war, and in imperialism, some new imperialist power's got to get rid of the old one and take its place on the world stage. You know, there's one that's declining, there's one that's rising, and there's one somewhere else. And you've got to include Europe. And we've had a question about China, a discussion about China from Liv earlier on in that thing, and I agree with that. But you've also got to include Europe in that. The world is dominated by those three big powers. Europe's got its own very specific problems, and it create a problem for itself. So I want to hear a bit more about the prospect of war from imperialism rather than just decline. You know.
You heard that, Peter?
I did indeed.
Bringing in Andy for a question now, because he has to leave soon.
Can you hear me?
Hello.
Hello. Yes. I'm kind of picking up from where Steve Freeman has started us. When Lenin and Hilperding wrote their works on finance, capital, and imperialism, the world at that time was very much carved up by the great powers, primarily Britain. And obviously we had the First World War, which essentially was about how the world would be redivided. Following the Second World War, we saw the dismantling of all those physical empires and US domination essentially via its kind of military might and its economic power. We're now in a situation where, oh, and actually just on that before I move on, I mean, we saw a kind of minor episode of that with the way that Greece was treated, where essentially the German state dumped on the Greek economy, dumped on Portugal to a lesser degree, and various other economies in Southern Europe. So that kind of mechanism for exporting your crisis was still in place and still is in place. But what we've seen, and a couple of people have mentioned the Belt and Road project of the Chinese state, where they're buying up tracts of agricultural land in Africa. They're looking to put, I don't know whether they've knocked it on the head yet, but they're looking to put some kind of canal through Nicaragua. So they're starting to physically occupy, or at least buy up, physically own parts of the world outside of China. And I was just wondering whether Peter thought we were entering into a new phase of the physical carving up of the world by the great powers, a situation which actually has some kind of reflection from what was happening at the turn of the 20th century. So you had back then a declining Britain, declining British imperialism, and a rising German imperialism. And obviously the First World War was an attempt by Britain to preempt Germany's rise. And it's whether we're likely to see some attempt by the US to preempt China actually becoming in a situation where it can challenge the US. I don't think China is there yet, but certainly I think what we're seeing is signs that the US is getting concerned about China's future ability to challenge it. And that's my question.
Thanks very much. I'm bringing Niv again.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay, I just wanted to make a few brief points. One was to say, again, looking at the global picture, when you look at what happened with Reagan and Thatcher and the economic changes that took place at that time, I think it is useful to to think about the reserve army of labour as actually moving east, because that is what's happened. I mean, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, many of those countries in Asia have become the workshop of the world in the way that the UK was in the 19th century and America was in the early part of the 20th century. Another quick point that I wanted to make was on the issue of speculative capitalism, and the fact that, and I think one of the points you made was that the size of the derivatives market as against the real economy. I think the way I see this is very much in terms of the history of money. When you look back at what's happened with money over centuries, so before the 19th century, before the Industrial Revolution really kicks off, you saw then, with the establishment of banks, you saw bubbles, South Sea bubble, black tulips, so you saw this speculation on what is, fictitious capital. That is what fictitious capital means. It's not real. And to a large extent, what happened in the 19th century was you saw governments getting involved with the banks to stop them doing this. that, as you said, broke down in the after the post-war settlement. And so if you look at, when you look at what's happened today, that enormous explosion of fictitious capital, it is just that. It is speculative money. And it's essentially, it's a bubble. And all bubbles burst. And that is the situation, I would say, that we're currently in at the moment, as far as fictitious capital is concerned. It's a bubble and it is definitely going to burst. And I suspect it will be sooner rather than later. To pick up also on some of the other points that have been made on China, I think, yeah, it is. I think the idea of war is a very real factor. It is very. I think there are a lot of similarities to what happened before the First World War. The major difference is that China is not a warmongering country. However, when you look at the American military bases that are circling around China, it clearly feels threatened. And from my understanding of my reading, they are increasing their expenditure now on the military. And certainly one of the hotspots looks to be those disputed islands in the South China Sea, some of which China is now using as military takeoff for their new military air force. So yeah, I do see this as heating up, and the next big thing really in terms of how where the Americans are likely to strike next. The Middle East, to my mind, all the wars that have gone on there, they've been resource wars. They've been about oil, controlling oil. And where we are today in terms of our knowledge of what's happening with climate change, the likelihood is that there's going to be a huge shift in investment and expenditure on alternative sources of energy, in which case the oil producing areas of the world will be less important. But China will certainly be more important, I would say, because of the fact its economy is so strong and also so large. To pick up on some of the other points that are made about China, I mean, yeah, I see it really as state capitalism. However, it's more than that. It's a real hybrid because of the fact that it's got so many contracts, so many dealings with multinational corporations. So it's by no means black and white, and it's a very complex, I would say, situation, and you certainly can't simplify the Chinese economy into in terms of saying it's capitalist or it's totally state controlled. It is basically state controlled, but there is that element of capitalism in there as well. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Liv. Last speaker from the floor is Stan, unless somebody else indicates now, and I will ask Peter to sum up after Stan.
Yeah. Sorry, just fixing things. Yes, whatever China is, it's got absolutely nothing to do with working class liberation. The working class in China is an oppressed class, perfectly obviously. And yes, it's not pure in the sense of how do you want to define it, an interesting question. But we are living in the period of transition, aren't we, from capitalism to communism. And we're in the process of hybrid states and messy combinations. I mean, in Britain, we've got the welfare state, or we had the welfare state that's been encroached now, but that is an element of socialism within capitalism, if you like. Capitalism pure and simple can't exist because of the power of the working class and the historical circumstances that occurred. So that's my first point. Second point, capitalism doesn't collapse, right? It may have crises, and they can have devastating consequences on us, on the working class. And of course, it doesn't matter much to us in Britain if people in far off, under and medium developed countries suffer hell and high water. You know, we can quietly ignore that until it's got here, but it seems to be coming here, doesn't it? So we better wise up to the fact that the working class is a world class, and solidarity extends across all the borders, and we all go down together, or we all supersede capitalism together. Capitalism is in decline. There's some talk earlier about decline of capital, decline of capitalism. Yes, so social forms exist within it, and the principle of producing value, accumulating capital to produce more and more value, is being superseded within capitalism itself. But that doesn't end it. It only ends when we do it, when the working class overcomes it and supersedes it positively to make to enter into the socialist transitional phase of working class rule in the world, leading to communism, classless society. So the incident of the recent trouble with COVID, with the virus, is it's shown us, isn't it, what a bad way that capitalism deals with the problem, and the same thing applies, of course, to ecological disaster. Capitalism is no way fit to run the world in these circumstances, and it doesn't matter as far as the system goes what trouble it gives to us. I think Steve Freeman was quite right to say it's state finance capital, that what you have is, there's a myth going around, isn't there, or has been around, about finance being so big that it diminishes, it rules over states. But no, if you want to consider all the states, well, what about the United States? That's the big one. And that certainly dominates the pecking order, the hierarchy of capitalist states in which we live. So it is possible for one top dog state to be superseded by another. It's happened in the past, like when Britain was top dog and superseded by the United States. But I don't think that's coming. Comparison with World War I, in World War I, we knew beforehand who the protagonists were, who the challengers were, and so on. And China today, which people are pointing to as an alternative world hegemon, it would be a world capitalist hegemon if it was. We don't want it. We don't want that alternative. And it's certainly possible for the United States to push back and to prevent its decline, to reverse its decline as the dominant state power in the world. And it's doing that now. And so what we want to do, what we need to do, is to make sure that what takes over from United States dominance is the world working class, starting, I think, with Europe, that we could win in Europe and we could then win the rest. Thank you.
When are we doing this, Dan?
Yep, next week.
Next week, yeah. Alan had another question.
Well, it wasn't a question, and I wasn't going to speak, but I just wanted to speak to what Stan had just said about the idea of a hybrid, when a period of hybrid transition from capitalism to socialism, that we're seeing elements of socialism within capitalism. I've seen that referred to a lot amongst what I would call the social democratic left, and that extends far beyond the Labour Party in my mind. But I think that's misunderstands socialism, and if you think that we're seeing any elements of socialism, then you miss the reality of socialism being about social relations. And the problem we have is not that socialism is growing in strength within a weakening capitalism, but I think the points that Peter was making about the weakness of the workers' movement would indicate that in terms of where we stand at this moment in time, socialism is further away than it's been for any time, perhaps. The working class is so weak, and it is the working class taking power and beginning to dismantling during the period of the dictatorship of the proletariat classes and getting rid of the ruling class, and that poses the possibility of socialism, which is when you've moved beyond class society and indeed moved beyond money. I think that it's very dangerous to be talking about elements of socialism within capitalism that's necessarily posing illusions and reformism. As regards what might come after this, who says that we're going to have a unipolar world again with one hegemon? It may be that we're entering a world of a multipolar imperialist world. And just on the danger of war, I think that's very real, just quickly to finish up. But I think that it's very important not to just see that in terms of economic issues and the decline of the preeminence of the United States and the potential for them to act preemptively against the threat to their hegemony, or moving to increasingly significant trade wars, which, as Steve Friedman pointed out, will lead to hot wars. But I've just got to reiterate, we have to look at everything now in the context of ecological collapse. I mean, just have a read about the potential for extreme weather events to cause a multi-collapse in the central food production areas, because international capitalism has got these massive concentrations of food production. If you get some of those extreme weather events, which have so far just hit particular regions, if you get a couple of those happening together, then you've got food shortages, including in imperialist heartlands. Mass migrations of people are coming within the next couple of decades out of the areas around the equator, as it becomes impossible to live there. All that feeds into the dynamics towards war, and I don't think that it's really possible not to have that as an integral part of any kind of socialist understanding of the coming period. Finish.
Thank you, Alan. Quick point in defense of Stan Keeble. I don't think he was saying that capitalism would sort of automatically transform into socialism because it has elements of socialism within it. I think he was talking about how social systems change and how they have changed in history, when quantity turns into quality at a particular moment in time. But you know, there were elements of capitalism within feudalism, etc., etc. But that's a side point. Looking forward to Peter Kennedy summing up now.
Thanks for all the contributions, and I'm not going to kind of like deal with all the questions and identify all the names. I'll just take some certain things. First off, the imperialism. Yeah, I don't think it's gone away, imperialism, but it doesn't happen the same way. It doesn't have the same impact. If you look at the kind of movement from British imperialism to US hegemony, took place in the context of the Cold War. So that's a significantly different context. And also against the backdrop of the Bretton Woods Agreement, you know, coming off gold, and a loose alignment of currencies around, for reasons I mentioned before. So they're different circumstances. So each time there's an imperial hegemon comes into being, it is so in a different context. And it seems to me that the context now is even harder for a state-led imperialism, because if you look at two things, look at who's investing in the world stock markets. That seems to be internationalized. You know, China is a big investor in the US stock market. And if you look at production is global. The production of cars, look what goes into cars, the product itself, it's sourced globally. Car companies are in partnership with each other over the production of certain models of cars and makes of cars to support that. And that goes on, that ripples across in all sorts of areas, you know, the high-tech industry, the steel industry. And so I don't see how imperialism, I can see imperialism in terms of capital expansion, but not in terms of war. I think that's harder now, because no country wants to destroy its own capital abroad. You know, the knock-on effects of one nation suffering a major defeat has implications for the rest of the globe. And until I hear a convincing argument that that won't happen and bring the whole capitalist class down as a global class, or the whole of global capitalism down, forget about class, then I don't see that as happening the same way as in the past. There's too much global integration of capital, finance, and also at the production level. And it seems to me as well that the world right now, if you think about it, I know this idea that's been expressed about capitalism, socialism, and communism, as if like there's an arrow of time between these things. I'm sort of like a little bit believer in sort of Einstein's theory of relativity, whereby he kind of sees the world bending on itself a bit. So that, and this fits into the idea what Marx described as the communism as a real development, a real movement. And by that he meant, you know, when Marx says real, he used that word real, he means it. He means that within the here and now, there is a movement which could lead us to communism, or to barbarism, for that matter. And I think that socialism is sandwiched in the middle, to put it bluntly, of capitalism, the real development of capitalism, the real movement of capitalism now, which is not like before, has colonized aspects of socialism to kind of, as a kind of survival mechanism when required. As in the case of post-war boom, that was a survival mechanism. And it's colonized the idea of socialism. Not to say that it will always colonize that idea, because it depends on the balance of class forces to win the idea of socialism again away from capitalism. But nevertheless, it's colonized it to prevent communism. That's what I think. I think Marx spoke about communism a lot more than he did socialism. He spoke about the science of socialism, socialist science, the scientific analysis of society. But he spoke about the real movements of communism. And in many ways, Marx was talking about an inherently unstable transition entity called socialism. It's inherently unstable because it's liable to fall either side of the class divide and become colonized by either of the classes. But I think that's the kind of world we live in. And so, yeah, I don't dispute that imperialism is still there in terms of capital export, but it's in a very different context. And I can't see Europe getting its scale together. You know, at the moment, I can see more evidence of Europe falling apart politically than staying together. And again, I'm not saying it's going to fall apart, but there's a lot of fragmentation there, a lot of division. I couldn't see it being anything like a world hegemon. The US states, looks like it's fragmenting more now as well. So, you know, that's a part of the crumbling of that particular hegemon. But going back to Stalinism, which Anne raised, and I think, that's the kind of the way I look at Stalinism, that it was a defeat of the working class. And when we mention the gains of this social democracy, then look at, it was the police and abuse value. And that means that the working class had no democratic control over the NHS, no democratic control over public sector works, nationalised works, and so forth. And so that's why it wasn't a gain. It was an administration of capitalism at a time when it was required to survive based on administration and based on the control of finance capital. So at the end of 2 world wars, I don't see that as a victory for the working class. I see that as an ideal context within which their defeat is prolonged. The defeat of the Bolshevik Revolution is prolonged through Stalinism and into the social democratic period. I'll probably leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Alan. Alan, that's not your name. Peter, thank you very much.
Yep.
Peter. It's a fascinating debate. I really enjoyed it. I think it opened up a lot of questions. Definitely a webinar on China and the threat of war would be very interesting. I think that you make a really strong case that, you know, why would a country destroy its own investments, which would happen in a world war. But there's certainly something brewing, and it could possibly be sorted out without a war, or will come to a head without a war, but it's certainly a danger there. So that's definitely, it would be an interesting session. I also think we we do need some other sessions looking at some more basic concepts. What is money? Somebody asked in there. What is socialism? What is communism? I think there's we could also look at some of these issues and what is the difference between the two. So I really very much enjoyed that. And we have on the 23rd of June, we do have a session on the Soviet Union and why it collapsed. So that might be an interesting session for comrades to attend as well. And we'll send out invitations in the next few days. So thank you very much, Peter. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.